Hello, my name is Christina Mata, and my presentation today will be about the Houston Drug Lab scandal. So, on January 26, 2012, Jonathan Salvador, who was a lab analyst at the Houston Regional Crime Laboratory, one of his coworkers had went to use his gas spectrometer and noticed that Salvador had just ran a sample of alprazolam, which is the generic name for Xanax. The coworker went to locate the samples vial and discovered there was a mismatch between the number of the sample and the number of the vial in the tray. Now, that vial also contained alprazolam, and it was seen to be tested earlier in the day. That coworker then decided to pull the records on both of those samples that were tested and noticed that Salvador had trouble testing the second sample, but not the first one. And so that coworker had informed a colleague about this, and they decided to wait to see if Salvador would correct that mistake during their review process. However, Salvador did not correct it. Instead, he used the results obtained from the second sample for the first sample as well. Those coworkers then decided to notify their supervisor, who then went to conduct their own tests on those samples and eventually confirmed the misconduct by Salvador. Now, the supervisor did remove Salvador from his coursework and called the Texas Rangers and the state's Office of Inspector General. Now, after their investigation, they had found that Salvador had failed to properly follow laboratory protocols, misidentified substances, and dry labbed, which is falsified samples. And the state suspended Salvador until February 10th, and he eventually resigned on August 6th after not being indicted on these charges. The iOS IEC 17025 standards apply to the accreditation of forensic testing laboratories. In most countries, they are the standard for which most forensic labs must hold accreditation for in order to be deemed technically competent. And the content of some of these standards cover several factors, which include qualifications, training, and experience of staff members, whether the right equipment is being properly calibrated and maintained, there being adequate quality of insurance procedures, and there being proper sampling practices and appropriate testing procedures. In the next following slides, we'll be discussing the 6 non-compliant iOS standards that I found within the Houston Drug Lab scandal. The first 2 standards in question come from the section 6.2 personnel, and the standards are 6.2.3 and 6.2.5. Now, regarding standard 6.2.3, Salvador was asked to correct mistakes in about a third of all the tests that he had ran. There was periodic job evaluations that had noted Salvador struggled with understanding the overall chemistry and routinely scrambled to keep up with monthly work expectations. Now, the Houston Crime Lab didn't consider Salvador's issues about his work to be catastrophic, and even promoted Salvador despite his struggles and mistakes. In at least one of the cases, there's an error he conducted that included misplacing a decimal point that could have potentially led to an individual receiving a felony charge rather than a misdemeanor possession charge. And the laboratory failed to ensure that Salvador had the competence to perform his job duties in the lab accurately time and time again, allowing mistakes to be made and cases to be dismissed in the end. Now for standard 6.2.5, it did seem that the laboratory didn't have any procedures in place for training, supervising, or monitoring competence of their personnel. Salvador was part of an office culture there that just tolerated underperformance. After interviewing multiple colleagues of Salvador, Commissioner Sarah Kerrigan had noted that Salvador's work was just marginal and of low quality. He made multiple mistakes throughout his career, but was never required to attend training courses or ever supervised or monitored for competence, despite numerous red flags. And according to the lab, Salvador's problems were very systemic and his work was right on the edge of tolerable, though not catastrophic. The third standard in question comes from the section 7.7, ensuring the validity of results. And this standard is from 7.7.1. Now, regarding the standard, the laboratory did not seem to have a procedure in place for monitoring the validity of results until Salvador's January 26 incident. If they had done so, the laboratory could have possibly detected the trend that Salvador was unable to complete these activities competently and accurately. As it was stated previously, Salvador had made mistakes for about every 1 in 3 tests he conducted. There did not seem to be a procedure in place for preserving evidence of a case for future testing, as pretty much all the evidence in the case that Salvador worked on had been destroyed or severely degraded. And as a result of this scandal, the department implemented more stringent quality control measures to help prevent similar issues in the future. This fourth standard in question comes from the same 7.7 section, and the standard is 7.7.3. Now, regarding this standard, the coworker who had reported Salvador's misconduct had initially waited to see if Salvador would correct his mistake before they let their supervisor know the situation. Now, this then allowed Salvador to actually report his inaccurate results, despite having already known the inaccuracy of them and the pattern of his imprecise work. Salvador's work had been monitored in the past, and it was revealed that about a third of all the tests that he ran had mistakes. The laboratory used the results to assist Salvador in improving his laboratory activities, but he failed to do so every single time. However, he continued to be employed because he was a great guy trying to improve, despite his inability to do so. And the last two standards in question come from the section 7.8, reporting of results, and these two standards are 7.8.1.1 and 7.8.1.2. Regarding this standard, it was undetermined whether Salvador had intentionally misidentified the samples he tested, but it was confirmed that he had made countless mistakes in his analysis and reporting. Now, the January 26th incident, Salvador, of course, he used the same results from one sample for another. It was only discovered until his coworker reported this discrepancy after Salvador had already submitted/released his report. There have been multiple issues with Salvador's work in the past that were unknown until after that initial investigation. That expresses a non-compliance of review and authorizing Salvador's results before they were released. This was also despite the continuous pattern of Salvador making mistakes within his analysis and the laboratory management being aware of it. And finally, for the standard 7.8.1.2, the results for the cases that Salvador had worked on were not always reported accurately or included all the information necessary for the interpretation of those results. Also, the examples of the misinformation that was reported by Salvador, he had failed to identify psychedelic mushrooms in a sample. He mistook cocaine base for cocaine. He misidentified a sample as marijuana when it wasn't. He had used results from one sample for a different one, and he also misplaced a decimal for sample weight. And finally, here are my references. And thank you so much for watching.